So, hello and welcome again to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and my guest today is Chris Bache. Hi Chris.
Hi Ian.
And we found Chris quite recently. He was doing a lecture in London and I read his short bio that came along with the details for the lecture, and I thought, what a fascinating chap. So I invited him and he very kindly agreed to come along and talk with us today. Chris has written 3 books. I only have 2 here, but one is Lifecycles, a study of reincarnation in light of contemporary consciousness research. And then this one here, Dark Night, Early Dawn, Steps to a Deep Ecology of Mind. And then The Living Classroom, Teaching and Collective Consciousness. And then he has a new book, which isn't published yet, which is going to be called Diamonds from Heaven, a 20-year journey into the mind of the universe. So Chris, let's start with, you had these questions, didn't you? You worked for many years lecturing in comparative religions, psychology, I think, to some degree. Mm-hmm. And then, but you had these questions that were burning inside you.
Well, I was trained as a philosopher of religion, and philosophers of religion are concerned with, exploring the deeper questions of existence, the meaning of life, and the structure of the universe, and the limits of human consciousness. And these are the questions I've been trained to pursue in graduate school. And then I came to my university, Youngstown State University. And just as I came there, I encountered the work of Stan Grof in psychedelic research, and his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. This was 1978. And as soon as I read that book, I was so deeply impressed with the caliber of the research that he had done and the caliber of his mind, that I knew that I wanted to do this work.
And the questions you had were questions with a variation about consciousness. What are its potentials and patterns? What are its boundaries? These are slightly different from the not the usual who am I, what am I type questions.
Yeah.
So these have been obviously working in you for a time.
For a time, yeah. There were 2 people that I met my first year of teaching. One was Ian Stevenson and his work on reincarnation research, which opened up a whole world for me, because I finished graduate school as an atheistically inclined agnostic. Ian Stevenson opened up reincarnation. Stan opened up the opportunity to actually experience deeper dimensions of consciousness, and by entering those dimensions, experiencing deeper dimensions of existence itself. And that felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. What philosopher wouldn't want to do that?
Yes.
The problem, of course, is this was 78 and they had been made illegal in the United States. The first generation of work was over, and we were 40 years away from the renaissance of psychedelics that's taking place now. So I made a difficult choice. I decided to split my life. In my public life, I was a university professor. I did all the things professors do. I taught and published and served on committees. But in my private life, I began a private 20-year journey in using Grof's methods of, for me, high-dose LSD therapy, 73 sessions over 20 years. I worked for 4 years, I stopped for 6 years, and then I worked very intensely for 10 years. So overall, from 79 to 99, I did this work. But because it was illegal, and because if I had talked about this work, I would have lost my job, I had to keep quiet about it. And it wasn't until after I retired and after I was past the statute of limitations, because I don't do this work now, that I was able to begin to talk openly about what one can learn about consciousness and about the universe by following this particular method of exploration.
I think the interesting thing is you went into it as an adventure, but you went into it in a quite a disciplined way and an organised way.
Yeah.
And the sessions were all laid out. I think your first wife was supporting you in the sessions.
Yes.
And from what I've learned by talking to you and reading is that also the sessions in themselves were organised, but not by you, insofar as they were sequential.
Yeah.
And it's like, I didn't know so much about psychedelics. I know lots of people that have been on LSD trips, but it tended to be a trip and another trip, and it was for an adventure, and it wasn't a serious study.
Yeah.
And you approached it as a serious study.
Yeah.
And I think you talk about a big difference between doing that and doing it for a recreational purpose.
Yeah, I've never taken LSD and gone to a concert. I've never stayed up and talking with friends. This is a very specific methodology. It's completely internalized. It's Stan Grof's psychedelic therapy, as he describes in his book, Psychedelic LSD Therapy. You're totally isolated. You're cut off from the world. You're in a private space. You're lying down. You're wearing eye shades. You're listening to very carefully selected music. My first wife was and is a clinical psychologist, and she was my sitter. And you take the medicine, and then you completely surrender and let it take you where it will take you. And I did this work in contrast to current research with the renaissance of psychedelic research, which is very focused on healing, which is important work, very important.
And much smaller doses as well as
much lower doses, very low and gentler substances. I did this work as a philosopher. I wanted to explore the deep structure of consciousness that Stan had shown in his early work, and the structure of the universe itself. And I found that if you are willing to submit to this intense destructuring of consciousness, you go through not just one death and rebirth, but over time you go through a series of deaths and rebirths and deaths and rebirths that take you deeper and deeper and deeper into, what do we call it? The mind of the universe, the mind of the cosmos, the mind of God, And in my experience, I never controlled what was happening in the sessions. I would try to set intentions, but working at levels this high, which I don't recommend. I mean, I really...
Because it was 500, 600...
I was working at 500 to 600 micrograms.
Yes, yeah.
Which, now that I'm through it and looking back, I really don't recommend working in a sustained manner with levels that high. I would be much gentler on myself if I were doing it again. But at the time I didn't, I was young. And I took good care of myself. Very good care, and everything was very methodical. I kept detailed records within 24 hours of every session, making a complete phenomenological record, keeping track of all the variables of all the dates, and I studied the sessions over years because these are complex experiences. What I found was that if you open yourself deeply, you enter into a conversation with the universe. And the universe is interested in deepening your experience of it. And so the universe takes you in and teaches you and trains you and softens what needs to be softened, breaks what needs to be broken, in order to allow you to enter more and more intimately into the deep structure of reality.
But you see, doesn't it take a certain courage from you as a human being to allow that to happen? Because you've got no idea where it really leads.
Yeah, it does. And this is one of the great gifts that Stan Grof gave me. In reading his work, one of the deep gifts he gave me was to trust the process. If you submit to it, if you let it take you where it will take you, no matter how terrible it becomes, no matter how inscrutable the process, if you surrender to it, it will always culminate, it will take you through a breaking point, and then it will catch you. You will die. And then you will awaken into a different condition, a different reality, as a different being in a different dimension of existence.
So what do you mean that you will die? What would that actually mean in a tangible way?
in order to experience intimately the deep nature of reality, you can't take your ego into that reality and have a transpersonal experience. The only way to enter into these realities is to become a citizen of those realities. And our time-space identity, just by the conditioning of time and space, keeps us small. And in order to enter into vast expanses of reality, we have to let go of that which keeps us small. So literally, you go through a psychological death. The ego death is very common.
So ego death. So it's a death of a construction of who we think we are, who we've become through our conditioning.
Yeah. So I was a white, male, highly educated philosopher concerned with the meaning of existence. The universe broke me by turning into the exact opposite of all of those. For hours and hours, I experienced being female, being poor, being women of color, and being women who had no interest in philosophy whatsoever, which is perfectly fine, except it completely negated my sense of who I was. And when I finally yielded and let that happen and allowed myself to become a woman, it took me in the most marvelous experience of hundreds and hundreds of women's lives, showing me, just giving me the experience of being feminine that I wish every man had the opportunity to experience women as deeply as it gave it to me.
And when you say you, during these adventures, let's call them, what is the you? Because if the ego is dissolved, what is the you that's having this experience?
Yeah. That's one of the linguistic puzzles that kind of every mystic also always has to address. That I is not this I, but it is continuous with this I, but it's not this I. And so the first death is the death of ego. There is continuity of awareness, there's continuity of memory, but discontinuity of capacity. So when you die and wake up in a different reality, you remember who you are, but you are not who you were when you were a time-space human being. You literally have become a different kind of being for 6 to 8 hours at a time. Chris Bache gets shattered, and you literally learn how to be a different kind of being. And then once you stabilize consciousness at this post-egoic level, and you go through various purification and transformative processes, eventually, if you keep pushing, keep going deeper, it will ask you to surrender even more deeply. And it will, you have to give up something more fundamental than your personal identity. And when you do, and you wake up in that next reality, you're not Chris Bache, you're not even who Chris Bache died into, you are a different entity. When you come back, there is a thread of a memory, but you are literally remembering having been different beings or different dimensions of being.
You see, so is the transformation happening within the trip, or is it happening after you come back, or is it both?
Yeah. It's both. It's certainly both. And I want to say this, there's a lot of discussion of psychedelics and enlightenment, and does psychedelics lead to enlightenment, and what's the relationship, and is it counterproductive or is it productive? And these adventures were not aimed at enlightenment. They started that way. I started because I was interested in enlightenment, and I thought I could do these sessions and ego would die and I would get to enlightenment faster. But that turned out, it changed very quickly, because after I went through my first ego death, instead of personal transformation, the story opened up into a story of deep collective transformation. I began to enter into what I call the ocean of suffering, where I began to enter into what the Buddhists would call the hell realms, just the deep, deep suffering that still lives within the collective psyche. And this went on for 2 years, and so many sessions and so many years. It involved so many people. that it eventually shattered my perception of what was going on. It wasn't aimed at my personal transformation. It was aimed at some transformation of some aspect of the collective unconscious of humanity. And then after that, after I went through that, and after that culminated, I entered into archetypal reality. And when I entered into archetypal reality, I went through a phase where I had to cease to be a human being. And I discovered that there is a human identity which is deeper than your individual human identity. And just as I had to die as Chris Bache in order to become something larger, I had to die as a human being per se. I had to go completely outside any frame of reference of humanity to move into, best as I could determine, was archetypal reality. Different dimensions of archetypal reality. And each of those, every step deeper is a step into a much more intense modality of energy. So every step deeper is a step into a very, very intense energy field. So intense that in the beginning it can be shattering and very hard to maintain coherent awareness. But I found that if I went back again, and I went back again over a year, and I went back again systematically about 5 times a year, that you go through a purification process and a clarification process, that you learn how to stay conscious in levels of reality that in the beginning you could not stay conscious in, that you have to practice it.
Yeah, I think to give it some context,
Yeah.
you did 73 trips
Yeah.
over the 20 years.
But I would never say trips.
Good. So what you would use the word
Sessions.
73 sessions
Yeah.
over 20 years.
Yeah.
And then each session, no matter how long the gap, was sequential.
Yeah.
So what would happen is at the end of one session, the next session, you would start where you left off the previous one.
Approximately. There's, sometimes you have to sort of see the whole sequence before you understand the logic of the flow.
Yes.
It wasn't. It was kind of like keeping a dream journal. There is a logical flow that you can identify, but sometimes you have to kind of go several layers down before you can see the overarching story. Yeah.
Yes. No, I understand.
Yeah.
And you took the time in between to kind of to integrate, absorb what had happened, and also you were saying last night when we had dinner that also your body had to, not as if it was recovering as such, but the body was adapting because the energy you're in when you're in the session, it's such a powerful energy, and you've got the absolute coming into a finite vessel, which has to be able to accommodate that energy, and that was quite a big thing, wasn't it?
Huge. Because every step deeper is more intense, and when you go into these states, you open up into vast fields of consciousness, and the energy is just huge, and it's running through your system, and you have to prepare your body to go into those states. And then after your system shrinks down after the session, you have to then continue to work with your body to help it absorb the experiences in a healthy manner. You really have to stay clean in your heart habits and in your meditation and in your yoga practice, and in all the structural aspects of your body. And I found my system had kind of a natural capacity to let go, and I never had any trouble coming back. There was a natural congealing, but you have to monitor your system very carefully throughout. And I would have a session, I would write it all up, and I would have 2 or 3 months to think about it, absorb it, to ponder it, to follow its teachings, because it gives you teachings.
Yes.
And then I would open up again, and the process would repeat itself in this manner.
Because you also talked about there's layers of conditioning that you're letting go of. And it's not like you are saying, I'm letting go. In the sessions, the letting go is happening because there's an allowance there. I
surrender. The universe or this creative intelligence takes me in. Usually what happens in a session is the first half of the session is spent in some form of intense purification, and then it reaches a peak, and you're drawn then into the second half of the session, which is some type of ecstatic experience, some deeper immersion into the divine, and then a series of teachings. And then the system slowly closes down.
And do you remember all those teachings when you come back?
I do.
Wow.
Now, I have to qualify that just a little bit. Many layers. And you go through this death-rebirth cycle. Death, rebirth, and if you stop there, you stay at that level. But if you keep pushing and driving, and that's one of the things I found about the high-dose LSD work. It's just huge power. It keeps pushing you to your edges, to your outer limits. When you break into a new level, when you first break into a new level, it's a different system, different rules. It works by a different process. And when you first break through, often recall is hard. And you get pieces, you get aspects, but they don't always cohere in a way that makes sense to you. So your account will have sessions, will have gaps. But if you go back again, and you go back again, and you go back again, you train yourself how to stay conscious in that level of reality. You go through purification and more purification, and eventually you're able to maintain coherent cognition at that level of reality. At that point, the pieces begin to cohere. You get a more coherent map of what's going on. You get a clear, stabilized vision. And this is one of the differences between therapeutic work and tripping. If you trip, you may touch these places, here or there. But if you want to have sustained conscious experience at various levels of reality, you have to pay your dues, and you have to work to be conscious at that level. When you do that, you come back, I am able to bring it all back. And when I write my account, I found that there's a technique I used, which was the day after a session, you're kind of a porous. I would play the music that was used in the session in exactly the same order in which it was played, and I would write the session up listening to the music that I had used in the session. So it would kind of put me 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And I could get back into the space, and it would help me remember, and I would get it down in print, always pushing it. But with work, with careful attention, in the session and afterwards, you can retain it.
I think one of the things that I particularly liked I think it was in the Dark Knight book, was that you stressed that you cannot fully awaken individually, because you had the realization that at the absolute level, which you were visiting, certainly part of the time, that it is all one. Yeah. So when you come back to the human vessel, it makes a real myth that someone can awaken individually when the next person isn't fully awake. How can that be that an individual awakes, another individual doesn't awake?
Yeah. The metaphor that I like to use when I'm teaching this with my students is the metaphor of the leaves and the trees. Leaves, if you imagine leaves being individually conscious, and yet they are manifestations of the consciousness of the tree. It's a both and. So we are both individually conscious, and there is a story of the individual evolution. But if you really kind of dig deep and you ask, well, what is an individual? Then you encounter the collective psyche, the consciousness of the planet, the consciousness of the galaxy, and then deeper into, as you say, the absolute, what I call my beloved. Individual awakening is really kind of, it's just a mistaken inference. It's true that if you don't work individually, you don't make progress. And yet, when you make progress, you are actually drawing into your work, I think, you had touched the consciousness of many people, and many people's consciousness are represented in your work, so it's impossible to put a boundary on awakening. And the universe doesn't, in this sense, doesn't even think in terms of individuals. I mean, it does, but it also thinks in terms, it's interested in awakening the entire species. It's not interested in awakening this religion and that religion, or this planet and this continent and that continent. It's interested in taking the whole of the human family into its evolutionary progression. And I began to realize I wasn't doing these sessions for my personal work. I wasn't doing it to, for my personal healing or my personal transformation.
Yeah, it started with the questions, but the adventure led you far beyond those initial questions.
Yeah. And then beyond even collective transformation, it just became an adventure in knowing the universe, just an adventure in being drawn deep into intimacy with the creative intelligence, and drawn into causal reality, into oneness, into shunyata, emptiness, and into the fertile void, into the Satchitananda, the existence before existence. Just one adventure after another, deeper and deeper. And I have an acute sense of that the universe loves to be known. I mean, the universe wants to be known. So we are the universe. We are part of its knowing. And when we return to source, when we begin that journey back to point of origin, we are met with what do you call it again? We are met by this massive, supreme intelligence, this extraordinary compassion and loving beyond imagination. And it's so happy that part of it has come back to experience it and to know it. And it wants to show you creation. It wants to show you what has been going on. Because it's been working for billions and billions and billions of years. And we are just getting to where, in the last few thousand years, we can begin to open up deeply enough to consciously participate and to see the creative process. And it's so happy when we do that.
And do you have a view on, so your adventure took you to this knowledge, this experience, and yet there's other people that go the path of contemplation and meditation that have very similar experiences. Do you feel that your way was slightly different? I know in terms of substance it was, but do you feel the realizations and the knowledge of your way was that different from the way of contemplation and meditation?
No, I think that the cosmology that came out of this work is not different than the cosmology that you see in the great contemplative traditions, the great spiritual traditions. All honor to the great masters who have done this under the very power of their own daily practice. I mean, I taught courses in mysticism and meditation, and the great spiritual sages were always my teachers, always my masters, and they kept me. But what they describe and what I experienced seemed to fit hand in glove. So there's nothing new there. The only thing new is that we have a different method. Who could let someone of modest spiritual capacity, if they have sufficient determination and courage to submit to the regimen, even someone of modest spiritual capacity like me might have temporary experience of these things. Now, as Houston Smith said, a mystical experience does not a mystic make. So you can't take these experiences in and use them to maintain that consciousness permanently. It would be so good if you could. But by going back and forth and back and forth and doing the practice, doing your work in the daily way, hopefully more and more of it internalizes itself in your being, and you grow. You grow.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting thing was that you, midway through this adventure, you wrote this book, yes, the Living Classroom,
Yeah.
which was about what was happening with you with your students.
Yeah.
And you don't mention psychedelic experiments at all in this.
Yeah.
And yet something very special was happening between you and your students.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk briefly about that?
I wrote Living Classroom towards the end of my teaching career, and I don't mention psychedelics at all because it's not about psychedelics, it's about consciousness. But the backstory to it is I was teaching and I was doing my private work. And I never talked about my psychedelic experiences to my students. I never, I just kept a firewall between my professional life and my personal work. But what I found over time was that my students were being activated by my private work. That when I would go into deeper states of consciousness or go through some death rebirth process, they were spontaneously being activated in their own life in ways that I began to recognize were parallel to what was happening in my practice. And another thing began to happen. When I was lecturing on something, and I would just need an example to make a point and I would just pause and wait, and I would think of an example, and I would use the example. And students began to come up to me after class, and they began to say, it's funny that you used that example, because that's exactly what happened to me this week. And first this happened, I thought, well, okay, coincidence. But it kept happening. It kept happening, and the deeper I went in my work, these synchronicities began to touch very, very deep pieces of their life. And it was like there was a radar operating that was connecting me to where they were hurt, what they needed to hear, some healing that they needed, some idea that they needed. And when they would hear their life being suddenly in the room, they could not help but get involved deeply. And when I began to see that this was happening pretty regularly, I began to realize I have to understand this. I have to, not only do I have to understand it, but I have to figure out how, as an educator, how to work with it. Do I need to protect them from what's happening? Do I need to build barriers? Or how can I be myself and teach in a way that's safe for them and yet also allows me to just be who I am, what I am? And that's what the Living Classroom is about. It's about consciousness in its natural condition is boundless and endless and doesn't have firm membranes and edges. There is a private consciousness of a sort, but in its end, consciousness is like a lake. You throw in a stone, the ripples spread out. And so I developed a set of strategies for how to work with consciousness in the context of rooms of people, groups of people. And I also found out that there is a field energy. I mean, I'd read Rupert Sheldrake and his work in morphic fields. Yeah. But I'd always thought of morphic fields in terms of species, whole species. But what I found is that there are fields that congeal around courses. There are fields that congeal around students in a room. And if you teach the same course year after year after year, there's a field that congeals and gets stronger that reflects the learning of all the students who've taken that course with you. And that field accelerates the learning of students who take the course 5 or 10 years down the road. And so once you know that that's happening, you can begin to work cooperatively, strategically with those fields. So it's a whole different modality of pedagogy. You might call it, instead of a Newtonian pedagogy, it's a quantum pedagogy. So for example, I found it's important to close those fields at the end of a course. So if you open the room into kind of the collective energy of these fields, students get very deeply touched. I mean, they get deeply activated. But at the end of the course, I found that students were kind of showing up in my office after a course was over, and they just kind of wanted to talk, or And at first I thought, oh, that's nice. They had a good course.
Yeah.
But then I began to realize, now something's wrong. They were caught. They were still stuck. They were still connected to the field, but they didn't have any place to take it. So I began to realize, not only do you open these fields and work with them skillfully, you have to close them skillfully. So you have to go through a process both socially in the room and sort of shamanically in spiritual practice to close the fields, because you don't want to encourage that type of dependence. I want my students to be independent. I want them to take the learning, go to their next course, integrate what their next professor has to share.
Find their own field.
And find their own field.
Yeah.
And I want them free in the world. And so it's just lots of, there was a lot of learning.
I think there was one interesting example you used in the living classroom about how you found that when a student would ask you a question, if you didn't reply straight away, you just were open for a few seconds, you'd see like this door open, and a whole new dimension to the answer to the question would come.
Yeah. It was like I found if I stopped, and instead of saying the first thing that came to my mind, because pretty much every question they ask is something you've already heard before, but if I stopped, suddenly I saw a little a door in the back of my mind, and a piece of paper came through that door. Right. And I read the paper, and it was a different answer. Yeah. And so if I tried it, all of a sudden the eyes would light up, and the energy of the room would light up, and we would go in a new and novel direction. And so my teaching began to be a dialogue between I would do a lot of notes. I'm really thoroughly organized, but then this improvisation, and my understanding is the improvisation that was coming through this deeper consciousness connection was what happened when my mind was put into the context of our collective mind, and the teaching came out of a dialogue between the minds who were there and my mind who was there.
And you also talked about how the students were changing you.
Oh, yeah.
You felt that, and you talk about, as a quote from the book, over the years, the students broke me down and rebuilt me. Yeah. That's quite radical to say the students broke you down and rebuilt you.
Yeah. I've always was always blessed with really good students. They were willing to engage deeply the questions that I asked, and we danced together. And in that process, they opened up my heart. They invited me into the room, and they let me into their lives. Not in a counseling kind of way, but in an intellectual, in a philosophical inquiry kind of way. And we worked together, and in that process, they taught me about this hidden territory in the room. They taught me what could happen when good people of good hearts came together in this adventure. And they did. They broke me down. I learned, for example, at first I thought, a student would ask a question, and I would have an answer only because of an experience that had recently happened to me, or a book I had just recently read, or a session I just had. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I do the work, and suddenly the universe has this capacity to use my knowledge to seed knowledge in somebody else's life. And then I began to realize I had it all backwards. That sometimes I was having the experiences I was having and reading the books that I was reading because there was a questioning student who was coming to me in the future. So that my learning was actually being seeded by their desire to know. And once you let go at that level, once you stop thinking that you were the orchestrator of this entire enterprise, that it's really a collaborative enterprise right from the start, then and you realize that your learning and teaching is so deeply embedded in their learning and teaching, then where is the self in that? Where are the boundaries of the self? Yeah. It just becomes a dance of presences in the room. And when life uses you in that way, when life kind of uses you in that delicious way to when that cross-fertilization takes place, it's the sweetest feeling in the world to me. You know, you're just part of something larger. You release to it, and they release to it, and they took me there. I could not go there by myself. They took me there. Yeah.
And then at some point a great sadness came upon you on your adventure. You talk about, as years passed, you found yourself entering a deep sadness. Your enthusiasm for life was fading. You began to feel separated and marooned. Reached a point where you realized you was just waiting to die, to return to your beloved.
Yeah. That was after I stopped the journey.
Yes.
So I have to kind of fill in a little bit of a blank, and then I can say what happened after the journey. In the book, I tell the story, in Diamonds from Heaven, I tell the story of ego death, moving into the ocean of suffering, and then moving into archetypal reality, and then moving into causal reality, and it's having these wonderful unitive experiences. And I was completely satisfied at that point. I mean, you know, to merge so deeply. But there were still 5 years in the journey ahead. And what happened is I went through yet another cycle of death and rebirth, and I was taken into a domain of light that was so clear, so exquisitely, just clear beyond imagination. Buddhism calls it Dharmakaya, the absolute reality of clear light. And over 5 years and 26 sessions, I was taken into this reality 4 times, just 4 times. And in between those 4 sessions, there was tremendous purification, you know, and so it was, you literally, in these states of awareness, you become light. You just dissolve completely into light, and you have the qualities of light and the boundlessness of light, and you're just dissolved into the crystalline nature of the divine. Now, I don't mean divine in any theistic sense or in any conventional sense, but I don't know how else what other vocabulary to give to it. In each of those 4 adventures, going deeper into the divine, there were a series of things that happened, and then the divine began to come deeper into my body. But then I reached a point, after being handled very carefully and broken down, but handled carefully, and then this consciousness brought me to the end of my work. It brought me to the end. It gave me an overview of all of my sessions from the beginning to the end, to show me the whole pattern, to put all the pieces together. And then it gave me a last set of instructions as I was about to leave. I didn't know it was over, but it called it. And so I knew I had to stop my work. And the primary reason I stopped the work was because it became too difficult to come back from the light. It became so painful to come back into time and space after having dissolved so completely into this infinite light. And of course, light comes in many levels. It comes in early on. It has layers and layers and layers, but the diamond light is what I call the diamond light is a particularly it's a particular advanced form of the light. It's a very, very deep expression of light. So I stopped my sessions. And I had always been integrating my sessions carefully all the way through. But what I found was, when I stopped my sessions, and I thought I would now, because I'd done this work carefully, I would be able to just enjoy the fruits of that labor. But what I found over time is that a deep sadness settled in over me. And over time, I began to realize I was suffering from a loss of communion. There was such a longing for that light. And I did not have the spiritual maturity or the spiritual capacity to incarnate that light in my physical existence. And I reached a point where I began to realize I was just waiting to die. I was taking care of my students, taking care of my family. I was doing the things that I would do. But in my heart of hearts, I was waiting to die so I could return to the light. And I began, over the years, I began to realize that this is not right. This is not the way it's supposed to go. Somewhere along the way I made a mistake. I must have made a mistake, because this is not the way it's supposed to be. So I really went back and re-examined the whole process, and I began to realize that you could say I was suffering from too much God. But since the physical universe is the divine as well, I'd say I had lost balance, a balance between transcendence and immanence.
Yes.
I had plunged so deeply into the transcendent divine that I lost my foothold, my place in the immanent divine. And that's incredibly valuable. The immanent divine is so valuable. So I had to make a concerted effort to congeal my life and to come to terms with being where I was, as I was, and to continue the process of doing my spiritual practice so that I could let the divine, the light, enter more deeply into my body and into my consciousness. So it's an ongoing process. I mean, it's a work still in process.
Yes, but you also talk about in the book, the book's not published yet, the
Diamonds
from Heaven.
Yeah.
The human things like the family were so important to you in helping you sort of refine the ground and finding pleasure again in human things. Yeah. Because yes, you were almost blown away by what was there, but there's so much beauty also in the human realms that somehow, these are my words rather than yours, which have been taken out of significance, but in themselves they're wonderful.
Absolutely. I mean, my family was always my rock. My students and my family, I have 3 children, and just always coming back wherever I was on Saturday. Monday I was with my classes, and I was always with my children. Like these flowers on the table. What magnificent expressions of creation there are. And the diamond luminosity, the light is magnificent. We have a huge, tremendous hunger to touch these realms and return to them. But the physical world is the manifestation of that reality in tangible form. And so nature has been a tremendous balm for me. Just nature. The starry sky, being in the woods, being in nature, being with people. There's another aspect of that sadness. The sadness wasn't just loss of communion.
The isolation.
The other sadness is in our culture, I wasn't allowed to talk about these things. You know, in traditional culture, you bring your visions back to the elders who help you understand them, and because your visions are not meant for you. They're always collective. But in my culture, I wasn't allowed to talk about my sessions. I couldn't bring these visions back. I couldn't teach from them. I couldn't share them with my colleagues. And that sickness of silence just added to my sadness. It just isolated me. And it makes you sick inside. Living in a psychedelic closet is just as injurious as living in any other closet where you have to deny yourself in order to live in your culture. Writing Diamonds from Heaven was really my step back to the world and sharing these visions, doing what I was designed to do, to be a teacher. I share. Yes. Just to bring them forward, just to let, hopefully they'll be of use to people. Hopefully they'll find them helpful in some way. And to be able to begin to share them, to bring them back, to be able to speak without reservation about my experiences. And my experiences are not important in that. What's important is all of our experiences. I mean, what's important is that all of our experiences of the transcendent reality, or these realities, be put on the table, we look at them together, and we find out what's important, what's not important. So I don't have any attachment to I don't own these experiences.
Yeah, but it took you. You also say in one of the books that at the end of the 20 years,
Yeah.
you were told, or you felt, it would take 20 years of integration.
Yeah.
And actually, the 20 years is up next year.
It's getting close. Yeah. Yeah.
And now you think it might take 20 lifetimes. Or
Yeah. At first, after I'd done the sessions and in my meditation, Spirit told me 20 years in, 20 years out, that it would take 20 years to absorb them. And now I'm coming close to those 20 years, and I'm thinking, that might have been optimistic, because these things are so deep. Sometimes it feels like it will take many lifetimes to absorb them. And that really, I have really basic questions. How do you integrate infinity into finite structures?
yes.
Some of my experiences involved going far into what I call deep time, outside of time and space, deep into the future, deep into different dimensions of time. How do you integrate those breaths of time into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday consciousness? And in the end, where I am now, I don't think you can. The only thing we can do is integrate our finite existence into the infinite. So we do our practice, we surrender, we make ourselves available, we do everything we can to respond to the needs of the present. And if we do that consistently, hopefully, then the infinite becomes a deeper and deeper living reality in our conscious awareness.
Yes, and again, I was saying to you last night that it's not so much just the experiences you had, which are amazing experiences. I find for myself, I get to understand something or have an experience or have a realization, and it can take me years to properly integrate that.
Yeah.
I realize it's still hanging around in a form that isn't totally something I can absorb, and I just think, I just feel more and more on the kind of the spiritual journey, people often give themselves too much of a hard time, because they think, well, I kind of got that, I must move on, and now I must get something else, or I should be clear. No, you do your best, but it's, as you found out, it's a process. It takes time. You cannot force these things. You can be available. You can do the meditation and the look after yourself and the any other supportive work. But it happens in its own time.
It does. It's a slow and gradual process. You can't cheat nature. It takes time. You can kind of push it, but in the end, you have to let nature take its course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris, I'm looking at the clock, and nature's taken its course, and now time is virtually up.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's been so good to have this conversation with you. Thank you for it.
Thank you for coming along to Conscious TV. And I'm going to mention your new book, which should be out sometime next year.
Next year sometime.
Diamonds from Heaven, a 20-year journey into the mind of the universe. And then there's 3 books already out: Dark Night, Early Dawn, Living Classroom, which we touched on about halfway through the interview, about Chris's teaching. And the first book, which I haven't actually seen, Lifecycles, a study of reincarnation in light of contemporary consciousness research. So if you're interested in Chris, there's a lot to read. There's also, I think you haven't got a website yet, but there is a lecture you did in Prague, which is about an hour long, which I found very useful for picking up the details of Chris's psychedelic adventure.
The International Transpersonal Conference last September in Prague.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to follow. And I think I'd like to explore this more on Conscious TV. So if you've got any ideas of people that we should look at interviewing them, then get in contact.
You bet.
Okay. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you for watching, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.